Hi, this is going to be a bottom-up knitting tutorial for a balloon sleeve. We'll start at the cuff, increase for the balloon sleeve, and knit all the way up until the shoulder. In this pattern, you will learn to cast on, knit, purl, knit front back, and bind off. If you don't know what all this means yet, don't worry, we're about to get started. But first, let's go over the materials you'll need. I'm using size 8 double-pointed needles and Red Heart Super Saver yarn. You can also use circular needles later on. The measurements you need are around the wrist, around the shoulder, and the length in between those two. For example, I'm planning to have my sleeve go all the way up the shoulder. I got my measurements mainly by trial and error, but how I recommend you to get your own is by casting on the stitch count you feel is right, knitting that for one row, and then casting off, but not cutting the yarn end just yet. Try the single loop on and see how you feel. If you notice pulling at the join, that means you should add on more stitches when you actually start making the sleeve. Keep in mind for the risk of you need to have an even number of stitches to get the ribbing pattern correct. First, we have to cast on the number of stitches we need for the wrist. To do this, make a slip knot by creating a loop with the yarn and pulling the longer end of it through. Add this loop onto your needle to act as your first stitch. Now you can cast on the remaining number by wrapping the long end of the yarn around your pointer finger and kind of smushing it on, as you'll see in the video. If I'm not explaining this very well, check the description. I'll include tutorials that helped me learn, but here's another close-up of me doing it. When adding another needle, make sure to keep the join between the needles really tight to avoid any gaps. Just keep going. As you can see here, you want there to be as little of a gap as possible between the needles, and just keep casting on until you reach your stitch count. The way that double-pointed needles work is that you're using straight needles to mimic a continuous circular shape. To do this, you create a square with your needles. My set came with 5 needles, so I'm casting onto 4 of those needles and then using the 5th needle to work around. The 5th needle will replace the needle I'm working on as I go, and I will use that needle to keep knitting. You'll see what I mean in a minute. Just some general information about working on double-pointed needles. Keep both ends of the needle you're working on above the others. Push your stitches to the middle of the needle when you're not working on it. Always finish a complete round. Don't stop in the middle. Don't worry about needles other than those that you're working on. Remember the beginning of the round, and you can use a marker to do this. To knit, keep the long piece of yarn in the back. Hold your needles like this. Take the needle without the stitches in your right hand and slip it from the bottom into the back loop of the first stitch. Then take the longer yarn and wrap it around your right needle. Pull this new loop on the right needle down through the initial loop, out to the front and off onto the right needle. You've just made your first knit. Purling is basically the opposite of knitting. You'll have to move the yarn towards the front, then put the needle into the front of the stitch coming in from the top. Wrap the yarn around the right needle and pull this loop back through the initial one to create another one, and then finally off the needle. After we've done the first 2 stitches, just continue this alternating pattern for the remainder of the needle, knitting 1 stitch and purling the next. This creates a knit 1 purl 1 ribbing pattern. After you've done 1 needle, set it down and reassemble that same square which we started out with. Make sure the joins between the needles are put in the correct direction before moving on to the next needle. For the second needle, we have a bit of a gap, so we're gonna tackle that right now. To do that, you just need to make sure you're knitting tighter. So as we go to knit, make sure to keep your tension very taut to prevent that gap from staying. Here we go to knit. I'm making sure to keep that tension in my yarn. And also make sure to do this for the second stitch, the purl. So still keeping that yarn very tight in my hand as I go to purl. It's best to start like this early on because then it gets easier as we go. And now that I'm done 2 stitches, you can keep working throughout the knit 1 purl 1 pattern. You can be a little bit loose throughout the rest of the needle. So this is a knit, pull it back, and then I move that yarn to the front for my purl. Wrap it around and pull it back. Last knit of the needle now. Push the needle through the back, wrap it around, and pull it down. Now yarn to the front for the final purl on the needle, final stitch as well. And now we're done the second needle. Knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl. Pull that end yarn a little bit tight and we can set it down and reassemble our square. Now we're looking at where the yarn points to our third needle. We'll work on that and move that to the front atop the other needles. Move that to the edge so we can start working on those stitches. And because we're starting with a knit, we're gonna put the yarn towards the back. Insert it to knit. Move the yarn to the front to purl. And we keep repeating those steps until we're done with the needle. Now we're done with our final purl of the needle. And we can see it's a knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl. And we can set that down and reassemble our square for our fourth needle. See where our yarn points is? That's to the fourth needle. Move that atop the other needles, and we're almost done with this first round. Now you can see with the fourth needle we're having a similar problem with that gap, just like we were having with the second. So again, just keep the yarn tension taut as you're going to knit and purl the first 2 stitches, and it'll get better over time. I'm going into knit, making sure my yarn tension is pretty tight to get rid of that gap that I had when I cast it on. Same with the purl, and then I can continue on throughout the needle, ending off with a purl, which makes sense because our beginning of the round started with a knit, which creates this continuous pattern throughout our wrist cuff. Now we're at the start of round 2. You can see knit, purl, 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 knit, purl. And our yarn is pointing to that first needle that we did. Now we're going to try to weave in this yarn tail that we had when we cast it on. So to do this, we're going to take both our long end of yarn and this little tail to the back. Treat them as if they're one long piece of yarn. So hold them both in your hand together, and we're just going to knit this tail with our longer piece of yarn. And just start doing that knit purl combination again. So we're knitting with both pieces of yarn together. And then move both pieces to the front to purl. At this point for our second knit, or third stitch, the yarn tail is almost gone, so try to keep it together, but at this point it's fully incorporated into our pattern. So we're going to go knit, and then now for our purl we only have this longer portion of the yarn, so we just purl and knit as normal for the rest of our needles. This is an easy way to get rid of our tail of yarn. And now it's the final purl of this needle. Again, set it down, reassemble that square. At this point you can kind of see that this is becoming more structured than it was initially, which will happen over time. This is our gap on the second needle. A little better, but not what we eventually want. So again, I'm going to move the yarn to the back and move this needle to the top to work on it. Don't tug on it as much as I did there. To tackle this gap, we're again gonna keep the tension very taut and tight as we knit and purl the first 2 stitches. Again, be a bit more gentle on those stitches than I was. Now our purl. Again, pulling tightly after we do each stitch. And then you just continue throughout the rest of the needle as normal. Now we're moving on to our third needle, but you can see that gap is a bit less in that area. Our yarn is pointing us to the third needle that we're going to move on to. Move our third needle to the top so that we can work on it. And then our yarn to the back. And let's keep going. Until we finish with our final purl on the third needle. Knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl. And our yarn is pointing us to the fourth and final needle of round 2. Move that to the top, and you can see we also had a gap problem here as we did on the second needle. So we're going to again make sure to knit a bit tighter. And purl tighter as well for our first 2 stitches, and then finish off the row as normal with a purl. This is the final result after about 3 rows of ribbing. Knit, purl, 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 knit, purl. That's our final result. After building up the rows, you can see the individual knit stitches with these V's. And then purls are a bit more inward with these U shapes. Some common mistakes include losing the stitch right at the end of a needle. So if the stitch is still there, you can just insert the needle in as normal and keep going on with the pattern. But if you actually unwound the stitch, I'll have some links in the description. how to fix that. And you could also have another problem where you snag the yarn like this, so you have an extra little bit of thread. To fix this, you just continue in the pattern as normal and treat that and the preceding stitch as just one stitch. This is what the pattern looks like as you keep going. It'll start to bow out upwards, and make sure to be gentle with this, but you can try on the pattern as you go and see how you like it. I would also recommend keeping a tally of how many rows you're doing for when you go to make your second sleeve. It'll just be easier. And then at this point you just keep building up the ribbing until we hit the portion where you want to do the balloon sleeve. Stick with me now. We all love noodles, but not in our knitting, because it leads to this. You can't tell me this doesn't look like instant ramen. To avoid unraveling everything, we're going to add a lifeline to our ribbing before we actually move on to the balloon portion. Thread a tapestry needle with a yarn of a contrasting color, like so. If you don't have a tapestry needle, I've used a bobby pin in the past as well, and it worked just fine. Thread this through the needles. Don't actually take your stitches off the needles, just wrap the lifeline through. This is what it should look like when you're done. If you mess up and need to unravel later on, you can do it partially and use the lifeline to put it back on your needles. This is a lifesaver, and I would recommend doing this before your increases for sure, but even afterwards throughout the sleeve too. To secure the lifeline, I did 2 more rows of ribbing, then moved on to the increases. For the increases, we'll be doing a knit front back. This gives a ribbing effect. As you can see in this test I did, the knits and the purls are there, but it's not as noticeable in the final product, and it's really easy to do. So you're going to basically knit the first stitch as you did before for the ribbing. The only difference is that at the end you don't take the stitch off the needle just yet. At this point you take your right needle to the back of the stitch, insert it again, and knit again. Then you can take the stitch fully off onto the right needle. This makes 2 stitches from 1. Just continue this for all the stitches to double them. Do yourself a favor and be a bit loose when increasing. If you're too stiff, it'll be hard to go forward. Right at the start of the increases you may get some holes, but don't worry, as you keep knitting they won't look so bad. But if they're still bothering you in the end, I've got some links to help you in the description. So I'm showing this again. You're going to insert your right needle into the stitch. Do knit it partially, but you don't take the needle fully off. Instead you insert it through the back loop and wrap it around again, and then you finally take it off. And just do this increase all the way throughout the first row of increases to effectively double your stitch count. Wrap it around, pull it to the front and then the back, insert the needle again, again wrap it around and pull those 2 stitches off. This is a really easy stitch because you already know how to knit and you're just adding some spice to it. Now we have to increase our wrist cuff all the way to our final amount. If you need to do halfsies, for example, my wrist cuff was 24 stitches to begin with. I increased all the way around to get 48 stitches, but I needed 64 stitches for my shoulder. To get this, I didn't increase all the way around in my second round of increases. Instead, I increased every 3rd stitch. This got me from 48 stitches to 64 stitches, and you can't really notice in the final product that I only did some stitches increasing on my second round. After you're done increasing, you're just gonna knit and knit and knit to create the stockinette pattern all the way up your arm until you're happy with it. This is just the knit stitch by itself, the same one that we previously did in the ribbing to create this smooth V effect. When you cast off, it's really important to have a certain edging because the stockinette will usually curve in on itself. So to do this, we're going to do the purl bind off. So to start out with, you're going to purl the first stitch as we did in the ribbing pattern, and then purl a second stitch onto your right needle, and we're going to work with these 2 stitches on the right needle. You're going to take the bottommost stitch over the top like this, and then you will only have 1 stitch. Then again, you're going to purl the stitch on the left needle. you have 2 stitches again, and then take the bottommost up over the top. Continue that throughout until you only have 1 stitch left. For that one, you just purl again, taking it up over another stitch. You pull the yarn through, leave a little bit of a tail, and cut that off. And in the end, you weave in that end, and you're done. Remove the lifeline, try it on, and you move on to the second sleeve. Let me know if you have any questions, and if you would like a tutorial for this pattern on straight needles as well. Thanks for watching.